Getting signal into the panel is easy enough. You can see the panel right here in front of you. There's a whole bunch of input faders here. Each fader adjusts the volume up or down. But to get sound into the panel, you need to first identify the input source that you're feeding into the panel. All of the audio sources, be they CD players, microphones, or what have you, all go into the panel, each on their own separate input fader. So if you find the right input fader and you switch it on and you put the fader up, you'll hear your source through the panel. As you can see here, I'm playing CD1. That's my source on the left-hand side of the CD deck there. So on the panel, I need to look for something called CD1. And of course, I can find that right here, CD1. So the first thing we have to do is switch it on. You can see that it's currently off. So if I switch it on, it goes red. And then I put the fader up like that. We're not hearing anything yet, but you can see that it is metering on the panel. You can see the meters bouncing there. If I put the CD1 fader down again, you can see that the metering goes away. If I turn the fader up again too high, you can see that the meter goes into the red. You don't want that, it's peaking out. The signal is distorting. We don't want to put distorted signal on air. So bring it back down a bit, anywhere between the -5, the 0, and the +5 decibels levels on the channel input faders. As a rule of thumb, they're usually the right position to have the fader. But we're still not actually hearing anything in the studio. So why is that? Well, that's because we haven't got the volume for the studio speakers up yet. They are fed by the panel, of course. Specifically, they're fed by the output of the panel. So if you look further along to the right, you'll see that there's another channel at the end which is sort of separated from all of the other input channels by just one sort of blank plate, and that's what's known as the monitor output fader, separated from the others. And you can see that currently what's called the monitor output fader is down completely. So if we turn that up, then of course we can monitor the signal because we can now hear it through the speakers. It's important to note here that the monitor fader only affects what you can hear in the studio, not what the listeners hear at home on the radio. What the listeners at home hear on the radio is determined by the input channel faders. So if I go like this with the monitor fader, erratically turning it up and down, that affects what I hear in the studio over those speakers, but it doesn't affect what the listeners hear at home. They won't hear me mucking around with the fader like that. Regardless of whether our monitor fader is up or down or fluctuating wildly like I was doing, as long as the signal is going into the panel, that is what the listener is hearing at home. But if you then do the same thing with the input fader for the CD player, so in other words, you're doing the same thing, but you're doing it with the input source fader, that will affect what the listener hears at home. So of course, that you don't want to do. If you want the listeners at home to hear what you're doing, the fader has to be up and the input channel has to be on. So you don't want to erratically muck around with the input fader, and you don't want to accidentally switch off the fader either. So that's basically how the panel works.